Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Winnie Lam, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome our speakers today, Jenny Ross and Kassie Siegel, who is at the back there with a big polar bear. So let me introduce our speakers. Jenny Ross is an award-winning photographer. She has won many, many photography awards, specializing in wildlife and conservation. Her most recent award is the World Press Photo Award, which is kind of like the Oscars for photojournalism, so it's a really big deal. Her photographs have been exhibited at the local California Academy of Sciences and at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. Our former president, Bill Clinton, also has her photographs in his private collection, so that's really cool. Kassie Siegel is the director of the Climate Law Institute at the Center for Biological Diversity. She sought to protect the polar bear by listing it as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. Prior to her becoming a lawyer at the Berkeley Law School, she was leading trips in Alaska for natural history. So without further ado, let's give a very warm welcome to our guests today, Jenny Ross and Kassie Siegel.
Hi, everybody. I appreciate your being here today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to speak with you and to share some of my photographs with you. Kassie and I are going to try to cover quite a bit of ground in a short amount of time today. So if you have questions as we go along, please do try to remember your questions. And then when we're finished, we'll try to answer them for you. So have any of you ever seen a wild polar bear in its natural habitat? Oh, a couple people. Fantastic. Excellent. Well, I hope that the rest of you do get that opportunity someday. It's truly an amazing experience. About 12 years ago, I saw and photographed polar bears for the first time in the wild. And of course, I was absolutely captivated by how magnificent looking they are. But I was also fascinated by how they managed to live seemingly comfortably in such an extreme and really totally alien world of ice. Their ability to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth is truly awe-inspiring. So at this point, I've spent literally thousands of hours in the Arctic in various regions, and I've photographed polar bears throughout the Arctic in all 5 of the Arctic countries. In addition, I've had the privilege of working with I've also had the privilege of working with and learning from many of the world's foremost experts on polar bear biology, as well as experts on a variety of other subjects relating to the Arctic and to climate change. So in addition to talking a bit about photography with you, I'd like to share some of the knowledge that I've gained over the years, particularly regarding polar bear biology, ecology, and behavior. In addition, I'd like to discuss some issues that I feel are extremely important, really crucial actually, concerning the impacts of climate change in the Arctic. But first, I'd like to tell you some things about my photography of polar bears. For me, understanding the science relating to these truly marvelous animals has not diminished in the least that feeling of being completely awestruck that I had when I first photographed a wild polar bear. In fact, on the contrary, the more I've learned about polar bears, the more fascinating and awe-inspiring they've actually become for me. So in my photography of polar bears, I'm not just trying to capture beautiful images of beautiful animals. Certainly, of course, I am trying to achieve that goal, but I'm really trying to do more than that, much more than that. In my images, I'm trying to explain the many things about these remarkable animals that make them exceptional and endlessly intriguing and worthy of our respect and our admiration, and of course worthy of our protection as well. In addition, I want my photographs to communicate that every bear is a unique individual, just like every one of us. Human beings have a rather unfortunate tendency to think of animals essentially as objects and as fungible. A bear is a bear is a bear, rather than as unique individuals. But the reality is that every polar bear has his or her own unique life history and experiences and distinctive personality. So I want people to understand what makes them tick, how they live their lives on a day-to-day basis, and how they manage to not only survive, but to thrive in what is truly one of the most incredibly harsh places on the planet. I also feel that it's essential to communicate in a way that the average non-scientist will really understand clearly and appreciate at a gut level that polar bears are truly threatened fundamentally by disappearing Arctic sea ice as the result of rising temperatures, and that the situation is getting worse. I believe that photography can be a very powerful tool for educating people about issues as to which they would otherwise have no frame of reference. And they can also be a very effective tool for inspiring people to have both an intellectual and an emotional connection to a subject matter, which motivates them to care about the issues involved. So my ongoing long-term project called Life on Thin Ice focuses on using photography combined with science to communicate with the public and with policymakers about climate change in the Arctic, about Arctic science issues, to explain what's happening, and to explain really why it's crucially important. So, what exactly is happening in the Arctic? And just as importantly, why should it really make a difference to you? Well, to put the matter simply, the Arctic really is ground zero for climate change. And it's undergoing a rapid, dramatic, and frankly ominous transformation that has very serious implications for our entire planet. And in briefly explaining that to you today, I'm going to focus specifically on polar bears, because they truly are the proverbial canaries in the coal mine with regard to climate change. So I'd like to start by discussing some key misconceptions regarding polar bears, because there are several that are very prevalent, and I think that they cause most people to believe incorrectly that rising Arctic temperatures and the disappearance of Arctic sea ice are really not a huge problem for polar bears, when in reality, those issues actually endanger the continued existence of polar bears. So, misconception number one. Polar bears exist in a single large population, and all of the bears essentially wander throughout the entire circumpolar Arctic. Well, this incorrect notion tends to lead people to believe, mistakenly, that as the Arctic sea ice melts and disappears in one area, polar bears can simply move to another area where there's more sea ice. Before I explain why that's incorrect, I want to pause just for a moment and make sure we're all on the same wavelength regarding what portion of the globe we're talking about. Take a look at this map, and I apologize it's not a Google Earth map. It certainly should be. So the map shows the entire northern hemisphere region surrounding the North Pole, and the dotted circle you see there is the Arctic Circle at approximately 66 degrees north. So the Arctic is typically defined as the region north of the Arctic Circle, all around the North Pole. So regarding that first misconception about polar bears, the scientific reality is that polar bears do not live in a single population with all of the bears just sort of wandering throughout that entire circumpolar Arctic region. Instead, scientists have determined that there are actually 19 separate subpopulations of polar bears in the Arctic, and each of these 19 regions represents an area where the circumscribed home ranges of numerous individual bears overlap and are concentrated within a discrete geographic region. And essentially, for the most part, the bears in each of these separate regions remain in each of these separate regions throughout their entire lives. In addition, the bears have very specific habitat preferences within each of those 19 areas. The range of polar bears is limited to places where the ocean is covered with ice or nearly covered with ice for most of the year. And the regions where polar bears strongly prefer to spend as much time as they possibly can are the areas where the sea ice is over the shallow continental shelf. So on this map, those shallow continental shelf regions are designated in white. And you can see that's a subset of that circumpolar Arctic region. So these areas designated in white are the places where there are the highest concentrations of polar bear. And that's because those are the places where the shallow ocean has the highest degree of biological productivity. Basically where there's a complex, dense web of life in the sea. So simply put, these are the areas where polar bears can find the highest concentrations of their prey. And they can use the ice to travel on the ocean and to hunt successfully. So misconception number 2 is that polar bears are omnivores, just like brown bears. Well, the reality is that brown bears are indeed omnivores, but polar bears are obligate carnivores. This misconception tends to lead people to believe that as the Arctic sea ice melts and disappears, polar bears can simply shift from living out on the sea ice to living on land, no problem. But that's not correct. Brown bears eat a wide variety of terrestrial foods. They eat berries and various types of vegetation. They eat insects, ground squirrels, and of course they eat fish. But the diet of polar bears is completely different, and it must be completely different. It is essential for polar bears to eat a very high-fat diet consisting of blubbery marine mammals. All polar bears in all regions of the Arctic prey on ice-dependent Arctic seals. In some areas, some polar bears occasionally eat other types of big, fat marine mammals, for example, walruses. If an appropriate opportunity arises, but for the most part, the bottom line is that polar bears eat seals. They actually have the capacity to digest and assimilate 97% of the fat that they eat, which is quite remarkable. and they must have that very high-fat diet. Misconception number 3. As the Arctic sea ice melts and shrinks, it becomes easier for polar bears to hunt seals because they catch their prey in the water. Well, this is absolutely false. With extraordinarily rare exceptions, polar bears cannot catch their prey in the water. Seals are much too quick and far too agile when they're swimming, and they can very easily evade a swimming polar bear. So how do polar bears catch seals then? Well, they use a variety of very interesting hunting techniques, and unfortunately I don't have the time to tell you about those today, but you're welcome to ask me questions about that issue later. But the bottom line, the crucial issue is that all polar bear hunting techniques rely in one way or another on the existence of sea ice. And in case you haven't spotted where the polar bear is in this photograph, he's right there in the lower right-hand portion of the frame, and he's using the sea ice as camouflage as he tries to get close to a distant seal that's lying on the ice. So regardless of the specific technique used, polar bears absolutely must utilize sea ice in some manner in order to hunt successfully. So in an ice-free ocean, polar bears simply cannot catch seals. They need the sea ice to travel long distances and to find their prey, and they need the ice to get close to seals in order to stalk them effectively, and they need the ice to actually catch seals. Furthermore, they need a sea ice platform in order to feed on their prey. Remember, they're out literally in the middle of the ocean. They need to have that sea ice platform. Misconception number 4. Polar bears are good swimmers, so shrinking ice cover really is not a problem for them, because they can easily travel from one area that does not have ice to another area that does have ice by swimming. Well, it is true that polar bears are excellent swimmers. They can very easily swim from one ice floe to another in regions where the ice is broken and separated by narrow channels of water, such as you see here in this photograph. But even though polar bears can swim very well, they cannot swim indefinitely. And they can have very serious problems when trying to swim very long distances. They can succumb to exhaustion and hypothermia, and they can easily drown in rough seas. In fact, in regions where polar bears have been forced recently to swim very far in rough seas because they're trying to reach that shrinking sea ice, scientists have already documented a number of instances in which polar bears have in fact drowned. In addition, it's even more difficult for cubs to swim long distances than it is for adult bears. Cubs have substantially less body fat than adults, and that of course means they're much less well insulated. So of course they get cold much more easily, and they can easily be incapacitated by hypothermia and drown. Also, having less body fat means that cubs are less buoyant. So it requires a lot more energy for them to swim. And they have a harder time keeping their heads above the water. And of course, that's particularly true when the ocean is rough. So the crucial issue to keep in mind is that polar bears have evolved over many tens of thousands of years to be uniquely well adapted, physically, physiologically, and behaviorally, for a very specialized, extremely narrow ecological niche in the Arctic. In fact, they are so perfectly adapted to the specific extreme conditions in the Arctic that they actually require sea ice for every essential aspect of their lives, including traveling, hunting, feeding, resting, finding mates, and breeding. So what is happening to the Arctic sea ice that polar bears and other Arctic animals depend on, that they actually must have in order to survive? Well, to put the situation bluntly, it's melting and it's disappearing. And before I explain that issue in a bit more detail, just as a preliminary matter, I want to be sure that you understand a couple of basic things about Arctic sea ice. There's an annual cycle during which the Arctic sea ice naturally grows to some extent and then shrinks to some degree. So each year, the Arctic sea ice reaches its annual maximum extent in the late winter, in approximately early March. And then after the summer melt season, each year the Arctic sea ice reaches its annual minimum extent in the fall, in approximately mid-September. And the most important issue to keep in mind concerning Arctic sea ice and climate change is that bright ice cover on the Arctic Ocean reflects most of the sun's radiation, whereas dark open ocean absorbs most of the sun's energy. So as the bright reflective ice cover on the ocean shrinks and more of the dark open ocean is exposed, the sea in that region absorbs far more of the sun's energy. The water temperature and the air temperature in that region increase, and the remaining ice melts more and more quickly. And by the way, the same principle applies to disappearing snow cover and ice on dark land as well. So what exactly has been happening in the Arctic to cause the sea ice to shrink? Well, most crucially, the concentrations of heat-trapping greenhouse gases in our atmosphere have dramatically increased. And that has led to rising temperatures. The global average temperature has been rising since the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. But during the last several decades, it has risen at a particularly significant rate. But importantly, temperatures in the Arctic have risen even faster than that. They've been rising at least twice as fast overall as temperatures around the globe, the global average temperature. And in many parts of the Arctic recently, the temperatures have been rising even more dramatically than that. Take a look at this NASA color-coded map, and I want to direct your attention specifically to the upper portion of the map where there's that huge swath of red all across the Arctic. So this map shows the temperature anomalies for all of 2011 in relation to the period 1951 to 1980. And as you can see, in most of the Arctic throughout 2011, temperatures were 3 to 4.5 degrees Celsius higher than they were just a few decades ago. That's about 5.5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in 2011, a very significant rise in temperature. So during the past few decades, as a result, we have lost immense quantities of Arctic sea ice. There is no legitimate debate about that fact. Scientific data show without a doubt that Arctic sea ice is unquestionably shrinking in both extent and in thickness. When the sea ice reached its annual minimum extent in September of 2011, that extent was 2.43 million square kilometers smaller than the average extent that existed from 1979 through 2000, and 2.43 million square kilometers is about 935,000 square miles. That's a lot of ice lost. In addition, the thickness of Arctic sea ice is decreasing even more dramatically. And of course, the thinner the ice, the more vulnerable to further melting it becomes. The Arctic sea ice has shriveled so much in thickness that the total volume of sea ice still remaining at the end of the melt season in September of 2011 was nearly 70% less than the average volume of sea ice that existed from 1979 to 2000. It's really difficult to emphasize strongly enough how significant the recent changes in the Arctic really are. During the last 30 years, as Arctic temperatures have risen dramatically, approximately 12,000 cubic kilometers of Arctic sea ice has completely disappeared. Let me try to give you a sense of how much ice that really is. Imagine that the ice is in a vast sheet, and that sheet has a uniform thickness of 3 feet. So 12,000 cubic kilometers of ice is enough ice to completely cover all of these countries with 3 feet thick ice. The entire United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, Mexico, England, Ireland, France, Italy, and Germany, and there would still be enough ice left over to cover New Jersey 2 more times with ice 3 feet thick. That is an enormous volume of ice, and it has completely disappeared. So what's the bottom line for the future of Arctic sea ice and for polar bears? Well, Dr. Mark Serez, who is the director of the U.S. National Snow and Ice Data Center, recently expressed the situation this way, and I'm quoting, "It's quite conceivable that the tipping point we talk about has already been reached. The Arctic summer sea ice is in a death spiral. Unless major action is taken very quickly to decrease our emissions of heat-trapping greenhouse gas into the atmosphere and to slow the pace of atmospheric warming, many scientists who specialize in studying Arctic sea ice believe that there will be essentially no summer sea ice remaining within 20 years. And it's possible that most of the ice will be gone long before that, possibly as quickly as sometime in the next 10 years. Take a look at this graph for a moment. A number of Arctic sea ice experts have recently determined that the data relating to Arctic sea ice volume actually reveal an exponential decline rather than a linear decline. So as you can see, if this trend continues, we may be headed for an ice-free Arctic Ocean in the summer within only a matter of a few years. So what about polar bears? Well, sadly, as I've explained, polar bears are truly dependent on sea ice for every essential aspect of their lives. If there is no sea ice, they simply cannot survive over the long term. And because of the loss of sea ice that has already occurred due to rising temperatures already, polar bears are already in trouble in various regions. In many parts of the Arctic, the amount of time that polar bears can be out on the Arctic sea ice hunting seals is decreasing significantly already, basically because the ice in the area where they live is disappearing. So many of those bears are being forced to spend increasingly lengthy periods of time stranded on land. And without sea ice, without the ability to hunt for seals, those polar bears stranded on land are food deprived. Now, some of those hungry bears may occasionally nibble on some vegetation, which is basically like one of us nibbling on a few potato chips and trying to survive on that. Some of the bears stranded on land may wander into inhabited areas, unfortunately, and get into trouble by searching for food too close to people. Definitely not a good situation at all. And some of them may even become so desperately hungry that they endanger their safety, searching for alternative foods, like this daredevil polar bear. I photographed this subadult male polar bear in Novaya Zemlya in the Russian high Arctic, and he was stranded on land, food deprived, because the sea ice had disappeared throughout the entire region, and he was trying unsuccessfully to eat seabird eggs on this nearly sheer cliff. So I was there bobbing up and down in a Zodiac, trying to stabilize my 100 to 400 millimeter lens and get some pictures of this incredible sight. And my heart was literally pounding in my throat because I was so worried that this crazy bear was going to fall off that cliff. Thankfully, he didn't, but he truly risked his life climbing on the cliff. And I think he burned more calories doing that than he would have gained even if he had been able to eat some of those seabird eggs. As I explained earlier, the simple reality is that polar bears need to eat a very high-fat diet. Alternative foods simply cannot sustain them over the long term. And recently, scientists have even documented incidents involving polar bear infanticide and cannibalism, situations where an adult male polar bear has killed a younger bear specifically for food. Now, these tragic occurrences appear to be rare, but scientists believe that they may become more common as sea ice increasingly disappears and it becomes increasingly difficult for polar bears to hunt for seals. So, as a result of being stranded on land for increasingly lengthy periods of time and suffering chronic nutritional stress, in some areas, polar bears are declining in physical condition. Fewer cubs are being born because of the deteriorating condition of adult female polar bears. The survival rates are being affected in some areas, and the size of some populations of polar bears is already declining. At this point, polar bear scientists have determined that 8 of the 19 polar bear populations in the world are already declining, and all polar bears in all regions of the Arctic will ultimately be endangered by loss of their sea ice habitat if current temperature trends continue. But it's also very important to keep in mind that the consequences of this dramatic transformation that's taking place in the Arctic are not just a problem for polar bears. Rising temperatures in the Arctic are affecting entire ecosystems. In addition, very importantly, what most people don't realize is that the Arctic plays a very important role, an essential role, in regulating our entire planet's climate system. So the impacts of a rapidly warming Arctic will ultimately affect every living thing on Earth, either directly or indirectly, including people. If rising greenhouse gas emissions and rising temperatures continue to the point that the Arctic becomes uninhabitable by polar bears, we will have completely transformed the climate of the entire planet in a very extreme manner. In fact, that climate transformation will be so extreme that there will be truly devastating consequences all across the globe for every ecosystem and every population of people. So fundamentally, these magnificent animals really are the charismatic canaries in the coal mine. Their plight is a clear warning to us that we must galvanize ourselves into action to address climate change, not only to protect polar bears and other Arctic animals, and not only to protect countless other species in ecosystems all across the globe, but ultimately also to protect ourselves. So I'm going to leave you with that very sobering thought and turn this over to Kassie. Again, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate your interest and your attention. And after Kassie's finished, I'd be very happy to answer whatever questions you have. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jenny, and a million thanks to Winnie for setting this up and to Google for hosting and for all of you for coming. It's really nice to be part of this conversation today and great to actually see Jenny's presentation. I haven't seen her give a talk in a number of years, so that was really wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. We brought me along to talk about the solutions and the good news because, of course, there are things we can do for polar bears. The two biggies to do for an endangered species like this: number one, remove other threats that are stressing them in addition to climate warming to give them a better chance of making it. And number two, of course, deep, rapid, and sustained greenhouse gas reductions. And the good news is that we do actually have the laws on the books today that require both those things. And so I'd like to very briefly just do two things. Tell the very condensed story of getting Endangered Species Act listing for the polar bear, and then saying a few words about where we're going, where we're headed next, and additional things we need to do. There's a couple of great things about the Endangered Species Act. It is the world's strongest law for the protection of imperiled species, and it specifically allows any person to petition to have a species added to the list of threatened and endangered species, provides mandatory timelines for the government to respond, and if they don't, you can sue them, and requires all of the decisions that the government make be made only on the basis of the best available science. So we petitioned to list polar bears because of global warming back in February of 2005, actually on the day that the Kyoto Protocol entered into force without the participation of the United States. During the Bush administration, of course, the Bush administration was not eager to list the polar bear or any other species, was opposed to this kind of regulation. But because of these three aspects of the law, we were able to push this petition forward to listing. The first strategy the government took was to just ignore the petition. We sued them, had to sue them twice, won both times, and got mandatory deadlines from the court by which they had to act. At that time, one of the things we thought we might have to do was litigate the science of global warming if the administration decided not to list the bear, which we thought was a real possibility. They didn't want to do it, but we thought we could win in court. The fact that they tried to ignore it, we had to sue a couple times, helped us also get media coverage of that, increase a little bit awareness of the polar bear's plight, which is an important thing. Unlike any other species that I've ever worked on, there was great suspense, a lot of public involvement. Over 750,000 people wrote in saying, please protect the bear, we want you to do this. The eyes of the world were truly on the administration right up until the day that they had to make the decision based on the court order. We didn't know what the decision was going to be, and in fact later, in litigation that's still going on, we found a memo from the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the wildlife management agency. He said, the Assistant Secretary of the Interior called me, so the Secretary of the Interior is the final decision maker, and said the Secretary is not going to list the polar bear. This was, just about a week before the final decision, and I said, well, all right, that's his decision to make, but I shouldn't be at the press conference because I can't support that decision. I think the bear should be listed. Somewhere in that week, This was at the very highest levels of the administration. The decision changed, and the Bush administration did list the bear. I think that's because they didn't want to litigate the science of climate change. So they listed the bear, and this brings some really strong legal protections. Things like the designation of critical habitat. Those are the areas essential for the survival and recovery of the bear. And vast areas of the Arctic Ocean and nearshore areas in Alaska have now been designated as critical habitat. The oil industry in the state of Alaska and others are suing over that, trying to get it undesignated, and so we're defending it, but that is a big protection. They have to prepare a recovery plan, and they're doing that now. We hope for the first time this recovery plan will set out the specific greenhouse gas reductions that are needed in order to protect the Arctic sea ice and protect the bear. There's also something that requires all federal agencies are going to carry out or approve an action that might impact the bears to consult with the Wildlife Management Agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, on the impact of their action. This has been a very successful program. Most species, once they're added to the list, have not gone extinct. Only 2 species ever have become extinct after being listed. Very, very successful. Global warming, of course, though, poses a new and overwhelming threat, and people often ask, well, what's the point, really? The Endangered Species Act can't do anything about greenhouse gases. Actually, it can. This consultation provision is one of the areas where we want to see that happen. Wildlife management agencies look at ways to reduce pesticides that harm frogs, mercury that harms fish, dams that harm salmon, etc. Both the Bush administration and the Obama administration have taken the position that greenhouse gases are somehow exempt from this portion of the law. And we're not arguing that the Endangered Species Act is a complete solution to global warming. Of course it's not. It's not even the leading domestic law for greenhouse reductions. That's actually the Clean Air Act. But I think it's a really important point because for some reason it is a powerful argument that any given tool is not the best tool or the right tool for reducing greenhouse emissions. So for example, opponents will argue, we shouldn't be using the Endangered Species Act. That's not suited. That was not the intent of the Endangered Species Act for greenhouse emissions. Let's use the Clean Air Act. But then when we get to the Clean Air Act, they say, no, the Clean Air Act is not the right tool. Let's use a market-based cap and trade program. But then when we get to having cap and trade legislation introduced in Congress, that legislation is killed. So there's a lot of debate over what is the right tool. And I think that the urgency of the situation clearly requires that we be using all tools in the box, not arguing about which one is the best while doing nothing at all. The Bush administration exempted greenhouse emissions from the reach of the Endangered Species Act. We've been in litigation over that. We did win on that part of the case, and that part of the decision has been sent back to the Obama administration for reconsideration, and there will be a public comment period opening up on that next month. And we hope that we will have the same level of involvement in that and having folks say, hey, we really shouldn't exempt the #1 threat to the species from the law. The other piece of the good news is that we have the strongest domestic environmental laws in the world. The Clean Air Act is actually all set up and ready to go to reduce emissions from all sectors of the economy. Has been a very successful law. It is political barriers that we are facing. We have widespread non-implementation and under-implementation of our existing laws for political reasons, not for legal reasons, I think not for technological reasons. We have so much low-hanging fruit. We need deep and sustained emissions reductions, but through energy efficiency, through existing technology, and through speeding the development and deployment of new technology, we really can solve this problem. We really do have the legal framework, but we have to get beyond the political barriers. That requires involvement from everyone. I truly don't think that the polar bear would have been listed as a threatened species had it not been for involvement. So my plea to you is to get involved in this and pushing for action on the climate crisis in whatever way is most appealing to you. If you would like to get involved through the center, I would not be any kind of activist without my clipboards, and so I do have them here. They're in the back of the room on that table. Please do, we have a general sign-up sheet. We have a petition to the EPA, which is headlined by Dr. Jim Hansen, leading scientist at NASA, Bill McKibben, and others, asking the EPA to use the Clean Air Act to reduce greenhouse gases back to below 350 parts per million. Various other materials, please do take them. They're heavy, and we don't produce a lot of paper, but I brought quite a lot today. And I will stop there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks so much, everybody.
Regarding the Endangered Species Act and that protection, you had shown a picture that there's many, many countries in a certain polar region. And so this is only covering a tiny fraction, it seems, the U.S. portion. So regarding protection for the bear and its habitat, and countries like Russia, Canada would seem to be far more greater in terms of the space that the polar bear lives. What's going on in those regions, and really, does it really matter? And if the U.S. has all this great protection and 90% of the terrain is essentially not protected, it seems pretty like a chaotic effort of chasing humans.
The bear is actually listed everywhere. You can list, list the worldwide species, which is what happened. Of course, you're only people subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. have their behavior curtailed by the Endangered Species Act. The critical habitat designation is actually only the U.S. land area. Canada actually has 2/3 of the world's polar bears. And the big conservation issue in Canada beyond global warming and oil spill is overhunting. Unfortunately, Canada is the only country in the world that still allows a trophy hunt of polar bears, and unfortunately, even though hunting was addressed fairly well by the 1973 Polar Bear Treaty, in 1994 the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act was amended to once again allow the import of trophy hunted polar bear carcasses into the U.S. Since that time, hunting levels went way, way up again. One of the ramifications of the listing under the ESA was that you can no longer import trophy hunted polar bears from Canada into the US. So I think that that hasn't entirely solved the problem. There's other ways we are trying to go about that in Canada. There is certainly a big international market for polar bear parts, but there has been some benefit internationally, and can be a lot of benefits.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on the implications for the rest of the world if all of the Arctic ice were to disappear?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part. If all the Arctic ice were to disappear?
What would be the implications for the rest of the world?
Oh, great
Yes.
question.
Yes.
Great question. I think we were both condensing today.
Yes.
It just so happens that the things we need to do to save the Arctic ice, I mean, the polar bear is, worth saving for itself as a magnificent animal. But it just so happens that the things we need to do to save the Arctic sea ice are the things we need to do to save the rest of the world as well. And I'm sure everybody knows, I mean, climate change is here now. If you live in Bangladesh, or you live in the sub-Saharan Africa, or you live in an Inuit community up in the Arctic, I mean, rapid climate change is happening now. And one of the things I find so exciting about working on the polar bears, we don't save the bear without saving the Arctic ice pack. Has huge ramifications for the global climate system. The Arctic ice pack, as Jenny alluded to, acts as the air conditioner for the planet. And when the ice melts, it's like unplugging that air conditioner. The reflectivity is one of the feedbacks in the Arctic. Release of methane as the permafrost thaws, another feedback. If we don't act soon enough to slow these feedbacks, we're looking at impacts like 20 feet or more of sea level rise around the world. So it's not that I don't think the polar bear is important in itself. I do, of course. I'm a biodiversity activist, but it's entirely connected. Saving the Arctic is entirely connected to solving all the other problems around the world as well.
And to just give you a few specific examples, sea level rise, as Kassie mentioned. Now, that's not from the Arctic sea ice melting, because that's ice that's floating on the ocean. That's, we'll get approximately 23, 24 feet of sea level rise from the melting of the Greenland ice cap. And that doesn't even include Antarctica. If we lose all of that land ice, we're looking at sea level rise in the range of 230 feet. I mean, entire countries will be underwater. And long before that, major cities, major coastal cities will be flooded. Imagine permanent flooding throughout downtown Manhattan. Apart from flooding, there's going to be an increased incident of very severe storms of various kinds, chronic severe droughts, shortages of fresh water, shortages of food related to the failure of agriculture, because huge regions that are now productive land are going to be transformed into essentially desiccated deserts, widespread extinction of species, ocean acidification, because the oceans absorb a lot of that carbon dioxide from the air, and that causes the water to acidify. And as the water becomes more acid, that destroys the ability of many creatures to function at all. And some of them that build shells can't build their shells anymore. And that's going to disrupt the entire ocean food chain. So if we wipe out a lot of the marine food chain, I don't know what the percentage is. I think it's like 80 to 85% of people on our planet rely on protein from the oceans for their food. So you can see that one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. And as I said, the implications are staggering. They will affect literally every living thing on Earth, including every population of people all around the globe.
So, sort of on a slightly different topic, but can you describe how you take these wonderful pictures? How you find yourself on the Zodiac and fight off the polar bears so they don't eat you, or how it works?
Well, there's a lot of variation in what is involved depending on the specific location and the specific circumstances. For some of those photographs, I was in a Zodiac down at polar bear level. In some situations, I'm on the ground, on the ice, sometimes in a vehicle, sometimes in a larger boat. It just totally depends on the specific location and the circumstances. But as far as having to fight off polar bears is concerned, yes, of course they are carnivores, but they would much rather eat a seal than a person. So I've never been in a situation where I felt threatened. Of course, I'm very careful, but it's not as if polar bears are out looking for people to eat.
Well, you had a lot of pictures of young cubs. I imagine if you got close to one of those, the bear might not eat you, but it would be you.
Sure. You have to, again, be very, very careful. It's important to understand behavior. Not only to be able to take photographs that communicate interesting and useful things to people, but also so that you can behave appropriately in proximity to bears. So because every bear is an individual, they don't all react the same way. They have different levels of tolerance for people being in proximity, and you have to be sensitive to that. Reading them is essential. And I never put myself into a situation where I'm close and I have no exit strategy. So in a lot of those photographs of mothers and cubs, it appears that I'm very, very close, but I'm in a Zodiac and they're at the edge of the sea ice. So I have the ability to back off if I need to. And I'm also, most of the time, not all the time, but much of the time I'm using a very long lens. So I'm not quite as close as it appears that I am.
What is the strategy for the greenhouse gas emissions from countries outside of America or even the North American region?
Well, I'm sorry to say that the US has long been a laggard and that the rest of the world is actually doing a lot more. Most of the rest of the world is doing a lot more than the US. So the main forum for that is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, international climate talks, in 1992, the whole world agreed to take the actions necessary to avoid dangerous climate change. The US Senate ratified that agreement. Also in there is the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities. That is, the rich developed countries of the world cause the problem. They will take the lead in solving the problem. We signed that, we ratified it. The first binding concrete agreement to reduce emissions was in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol. The Clinton administration negotiated that treaty. They actually got a lot of concessions from the rest of the world in terms of making the emissions reductions smaller and how those reductions would be achieved. But after signing the agreement in Kyoto, the US Senate was never submitted to the US Senate for ratification because the US Senate voted 95-0 in a non-binding resolution that the US shouldn't do anything unless the rest of the world also took on binding targets. Kyoto Protocol has binding mandatory reductions from the developed countries of the world, while the developing countries would take other actions as they try to reduce their emissions intensity while they continue to develop. I'm sorry to say that since '97, things have continued to devolve. Be happy to talk about it more after the talk if you'd like, but it is just the U.S. has been blocking progress at those talks, and a lot of the rest of the world is going on and doing more without the U.S. But we need to change things domestically here, and I think that's the #1 thing that will jumpstart international progress. And I think we should wrap it up as we're a little over time. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks very much.